Welcome to Denver Community Church Online. My name is John Gettings, and I'm so glad you're joining us today. Whether you attend one of our Denver locations on a Sunday or listen online, our hope is to be a group of people who are a just, generous community, practicing love in the ways of Jesus. As you listen to this teaching, allow it to begin a conversation with you and God, you and the Bible, and you and your community. If you have any questions about this teaching or DCC, email us. And if you'd like to help financially support our community and our partners as we give away 20% of every dollar that comes in, you can text Denver Church to 77977. Thank you for joining us today.
If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Exodus chapter 3. If you don't, there's a Bible beneath the chair in front of you or near you, and the page number on the screen behind me corresponds to that. As you find your place, I want to just catch us up in what's happening in the story from the end of Genesis into the beginning of Exodus, and then we'll pick up the story at Exodus 3, verse 1. What we learn at the end of Genesis is that the people of Israel, who at that time were a family, moved to Egypt. They begin growing quickly in number, and the king of Egypt says, if we don't really practice a form of population control, and if we don't control them, we are going to be in a lot of trouble. And so they enslave the Hebrew people, and they decide that they're going to kill all of the male children born into Hebrew families as a way of keeping everything at bay. One Hebrew woman gives birth to a boy, and through her ingenuity and courage, she keeps the boy alive and eventually puts him in the Nile River, where he is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. She takes him up out of the water and calls him Moses. He grows up in Pharaoh's household. One day later, as he's a grown man, he's walking around and he sees a slave driver from Egypt beating a Hebrew slave. Out of his own rage, he kills the slave driver, tries to cover up his crime. It doesn't work, and he goes on the run as a fugitive. He goes to a place called Midian where he meets a man named Jethro. Jethro introduces Moses to his daughter. Moses and his daughter get married, and Moses begins working for his father-in-law as a shepherd. And that's where we find ourselves in Exodus 3, verse 1. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, mosquito bites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, What is his name? Then what should I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Now, if you grew up religious, specifically within the Jewish tradition or the Christian tradition, this story was one that was told and is somewhat a commonly known story within those religious traditions. And one of the things that can happen is that when we hear stories from the time that we are young and we kind of are familiar with them, is we lose how bizarre these stories are. The story begins with a bush on fire that's not burning up, or as the rabbis say, fire without flame. And we learn that Moses is looking at this site long enough to sort out that it's not burning up, which again raises the question that have been asked by the rabbis over the centuries. How long do you have to look at a bush to realize that it's not burning up? How long do you have to figure out it's fire without flame? So right there, it's just a bit odd. And then Moses says, I'm going to go over and check this thing out. It's a little bit odd. So he goes over, and a voice speaks to him from the bush by name. And Moses' response is like, what's up? Which is a rough translation of the Hebrew there. Now, I don't know about you, but if you were in the wilderness all by yourself and you saw a bush that was on fire without flame, a bush that was on fire and not burning up, and you watched it long enough to figure out it wasn't burning up, and you walked over to it and a voice called you by name, is it a safe assumption to presume that you'd be a little bit weirded out? A few of you. Some of you are like, I don't know, it's never happened to me, right? No, you'd be totally weirded out. That's the first bizarre thing. Then you realize really quickly, Moses is meeting this God for the first time. Moses grew up in an Egyptian household, it's important to remember. He doesn't know who this God is. This is why God says, I'm the God of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm here because I know what's happening in Egypt to my people. And I want you to go to Pharaoh. In other words, I want you to go back to the land where you're a fugitive and tell Pharaoh, let your workforce go into the desert to worship me. And so Moses begins asking questions, probably out of resistance and out of curiosity, but who am I to go? And it's interesting, God doesn't say, well, you're this great leader. He just says, I'm with you. And I'll even give you a sign that I'm with you. And then Moses says, who are you? Now we read it as, what's your name? But it's important to remember that a name in the ancient context was a way of identifying one's self. A name meant something deep within. When Moses says, what is your name? He's saying, who are you? What kind of God are you? Who are you in your identity? Now, for us in our world, for names, some of you might have been named after an uncle, or some of you might have been named because your parents heard a name and thought, oh, I like it. Some of you who have kids might have just gotten online, babynames.com, and you're like, oh, I like Oliver. I don't think anyone's going to name their kid that. Turns out it's the most famous boy name of 2019. You just kind of pick a name. But names in the ancient context meant something. My name is Michael, which comes from the Hebrew Michael, which means who is like God. Now, for years, I thought that was the greatest name ever, because I'd walk around and be like, who has two thumbs and is like God? And then I found out it was a rhetorical question, meaning no one's like God. That was a pretty hard year for me when I found that out. The name Moses, Moshe, means taken from water. It's an Egyptian word. So God's name is, I am who I am. Now, something happens when you're translating, especially from an ancient language to a modern language. And for those of you who speak more than one language, besides the fact that you're not American, if you speak more than one language, you know it's hard to translate from one language into English because things break down. And that's what's happening here. So we read, I am who I am in the English and think, oh, we've got it down. We know this one. But what's interesting is no one really actually knows how to translate it. It could mean I will be what I will be. It could mean I was what I was. It could mean I was what I will be, or I will be what I was, or I will be what I am, or I am what I will be. No one really knows. Here's what we do know. It's a verb that means to be. The name of God means being. It's a statement of total and absolute, eternal and unchanging being. This is what we learn from this. Our Jewish friends, when they talk about God, when they reference God, the most common way they reference God is to say Hashem, which in Hebrew means the name. Because they recognize we don't even know what the name of God is. We don't know how to say the name of God. So they refer to it as the ineffable name, as the unspeakable name, as the unpronounceable name. Because there's a recognition that the name itself is a mystery, which means if the name itself is a mystery, then what it's saying is that the God of who this name speaks is also a mystery. It is a God that is endlessly knowable. A God that the more we get to know this God, the more we recognize there is to know. It's this God that is in some ways a foreboding darkness that we're invited to go into. It's a mystery. Now, one of the things I know, having grown up in the church, is that whenever somebody at the beginning of a sermon talks about a mystery, there's kind of this sense in the minds of some, especially those who've grown up in and around the church, of like, okay, so we're introduced to something we don't know right now, but somebody's investigated and researched and done his work, and that person's job is to stand up in front of everybody and explain to them the mystery so we can all leave knowing more than we know now. I'm so excited, right? It's the way we live our lives in our world. The way we live our lives in our world is that we have the answers at our fingertips. How many of you have a friend who's a know-it-all? A few of you, yeah. I didn't ask who here is a know-it-all because you wouldn't raise your hand. I had to ask who has a friend who's a know-it-all. The worst thing about know-it-alls in 2020 is that they have smartphones with Google on it. They're like a drunk superhero who is unable to rein in their power. Like, it just doesn't go well. So you've been there, right? You're out with friends, you're hanging out at somebody's house, and somebody brings something up, and you don't know the answer to it, and no one else does. And what do? They pull the smartphone out, and they Google it. Like, hang on. And the worst part is they begin reading what they've Googled like they're somehow knew the answer already, even though they too had to Google it. And then you realize they're reading from Wikipedia, and you're like, this is not a viable source. But this is what they do. You say something, they have the answer right here. We have it now, all the answers to everything in our pocket. There are other people who say things like, well, we may not know now, but just give us enough time, we'll figure it all out. I came across an article a few weeks ago and was talking with a friend of mine about it. And the article is now a new theory about the universes in our world. And it's a theory that talks about the Big Bang and says, when our universe burst into existence, we went this way into infinite expansion. But when that boom happened, another universe boomed and is also expanding into infinite expansion. But we, in our universe, experienced the flow of time this way, and in this other universe, the flow of time would be experienced differently. Which means the whole Seinfeld bit about the bizarro world is kind of true. So I'm having this conversation with my friend, and he's like, we'll figure it out. And I was like, figure what out? He's like, we'll get the answers. We'll just give it enough time. I mean, this is brand new. Just Google that stuff in like a year. I'm like, you really think we're going to figure all of this out? But this is the way that we think. And when it comes to mystery, certainly that's something that will in time be revealed and that we'll be able to explain. It's interesting to note that in the last 15 years, more than half of the most watched television shows in the United States are crime dramas that fall within the genre of mystery. So you have like American Justice, Cold Case Files, Cold Squad, Numbers, Bones, Without a Trace, NCIS, CSI Vegas, CSI Miami, CSI New York, CSI Cyber, and I wanted to point out all four of those because they are so different than one another, right? I mean, there's so many of these crime dramas in our world today, I can't imagine like what a pitch would look to when you go before the producers of a major network. I mean, what do you say? You walk into the meeting, you're like, all right, get this. The show begins with somebody finding a dead body. Like, we know. I mean, because this is the way every episode goes, right? Somebody's going about their business and they find a dead body. And then it cuts to now this same scene becomes a crime scene and there's police everywhere. They're all wearing the navy blue jackets that only high school football coaches wear. And they're walking around taking pictures and filing everything. As this is happening, a car pulls up, and out of the car is incredibly well-dressed people. And you're like, I don't think police officers can afford that kind of outfit, right? But they walk over, they're the experts, and one of these people in the navy blue jacket comes up next to them and starts giving them details. And they're not really fully paying attention to this underling because they're the expert. And as they walk, they're looking around for clues that the other people, of course, would have missed. And then when they get over to the body, they always squat down and take off their sunglasses, right? It's one move, it's this. And then they look at the body, and then they're listening to this guy talk, and they kind of look around, and then comes the one-liner that comes right before the commercial, like, this is not a job by an amateur. I guess we're looking for a pro. And you're like, oh my gosh, you are hooked. And in the next 42 minutes of TV, they do all of the investigation and research and everything else, and they find the killer. And you have this like fulfillment because it's mystery solved. Exactly. This is what we do. It's actually not a mystery. The writers just withhold all sorts of details and facts from you. Now, the best thing about these shows, by the way, in our current culture, is it's actually given rise to something called CSI syndrome. CSI syndrome, this was first written about in the USA Today in 2005. Now, I've spent like 20 years of my life researching, writing, preaching, all this stuff. I have never come across something that has made me happier than CSI syndrome. And here's why. CSI syndrome is the fact that both prosecutors and law enforcement have recognized that the burden of proof on prosecutors and law enforcement in criminal cases in the United States of America has risen because jurors expect more from forensic evidence, because what they see in these television shows, they believe is real life. Is that not the funniest thing you've ever heard? And they're calling it a syndrome. You can just like picture the deliberation room, right? I mean, they go through the trial. There's 17 eyewitnesses that see this person kill this person. It's just going to be like an open and shut case. And they're in the deliberation room with their files and the pictures around. And there's like that one guy who stands up and is like, I don't know. Because when I listen to the prosecution talk about when they discovered the body, when you look at the cadaver's ecosystem and the rate of decomposition and the DNA sequencing, it just doesn't add up. And somebody's like, Derek, you're in sales. Sit down, right? But we think we're going to get all of the answers. And by the way, we do this in religion too. Many of us grew up in a religious world where there's anywhere between 10 and 15 propositional statements, usually in bullet point form, on somebody's website that says, here's the total of our beliefs. We are trained to consider and to hold and to trust and to believe the answers. And not only that, but as we grow, we're then taught how to defend the answers that we've been given. But here's what's interesting to me. More and more, I hear from people, I know all the answers, I know all the verses, I know all the proof, I know all the arguments, I got it all down. But it's not working. It's not working. Like honestly, if the answers worked, we probably wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. And I think what's happening is we're living in a day and age where people are waking up going, yeah, we could explain all sorts of things, but there's all sorts of things, and actually the majority of things we can't explain. There's this understanding that somehow we're bumping up against mystery all of the time. There's a sense in which people are like, I don't know that I want a God that I can explain in 10 to 15 bullet points. I actually take great comfort in this idea of God as mystery. God is something far bigger and wholly other than anything we can imagine. And I would contend that most human beings do too. Have you ever met somebody, like maybe it's somebody who's new at work, or maybe it's a friend of a friend, or maybe it's a, first date or whatever it is, and you get together with this person, you begin talking, and you're about like 15 minutes in, and you're like, I think I've learned everything there is to know about you. You ever had that? You're at lunch with them, and before the food comes, you've kind of covered everything in their life, and you're like, this is going to be the most awkward BLT ever, because there's nothing left to talk about. When you meet somebody like that, you don't think, oh, I cannot wait to spend more time with them. Same isn't said for when you meet somebody and there's like this real depth to them that you instantly sense. And then you begin hearing their stories and the places that they've traveled and their family of origin and what brought them there and their perspective on things. And you're like, whoa, there's some depth here. And there's some depth here that probably could be explored forever. We call people like this intriguing. We're interested in them. Why? Why are we more interested in being drawn into something that we don't fully know? And why do we get bored so quick with someone that we can figure out in like 10 minutes? Is it possible that when it comes to our religious systems that so many of us have grown up in, that we're just bored? Because we figured it all out and we're like, this is it? I mean, I hear far more interesting things at the gym. And if this is it, see, I believe we long for this idea of mystery, not just all of these neat and tidy answers that we've been given. The wonderful poet Rainer Maria Rilke says this. He says, things are not all so comprehensible and expressible as one would mostly have us believe. Most events are inexpressible, taking place in a realm which no word has ever entered. And more inexpressible than all else are works of art, mysterious existences, the life of which, while ours passes away, endures. Have you ever gone to a concert, maybe it was a long time coming, like you were waiting to see your favorite band play, and then you finally get to see him play, and it's unreal, and 2 days later you run to a friend of yours, and like, how was the concert? And you go, oh man, you had to have been there. You ever had that experience? Because if your friend said, how was the concert? And you're like, well, it began with some music playing in the background, and then the house lights went down, and the stage was dark, but you could see the band, even though the stage was dark, kind of walk out to their instruments. And then they began playing that one song that's on the radio, and the lights came up and started moving with the beat. Your friend would be like, so the concert sucked. Because you're describing it in literal terms. You're able to wrap your head around it, and all of a sudden it's like, But there's these moments where there's something transcendent, and you're like, oh. There's a new documentary series out on Netflix called Babies. Has anyone seen this? I've not seen it yet, but turned on Netflix the other day. I'm on the couch with my daughter, and all I saw was the preview. And the preview begins with a close-up of a mother's face right after she gives birth, and they put the baby on her chest. And I'm sitting there with my daughter, and I just burst into tears. And my daughter's like, why are you crying, Dad? Like, why are you so insensitive, daughter? She didn't really say it like that. It felt like that. She said, Dad, why are you crying? And I said, someday you'll know. What am I supposed to say? Well, because there was this one day where your mom, no. There was just this, someday you might know. Because it's beyond all that. A few years ago, I went to the Grand Canyon for the first time. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, there's an interesting phenomenon to watch. If you go to the South Rim, you have to kind of walk through these woods to get to the Grand Canyon. So you don't really see anything except pine trees. And everyone's chatting and noisy. Have you been here before? Have you been there? Oh yeah, where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. And then you reach this clearing and you all of a sudden see this thing unfold before you. And everything gets pretty quiet. Because if somebody walks up to the edge of it and they're like, so I don't know if you noticed the geographic layers, everyone would be like, shut up. Because when you see that thing in nature, or if you're in the mountains and you witness a sunset over a lake, or you're in the mountains and you see wild animals and everyone stops and gets really quiet, there are moments even in the natural world that you go, I can't explain this. And you fall to silence because not everything is as expressible and comprehensible as many people have taught. And whether it's an unbelievable show or whether it's the birth of a child or new love or whether it's something in nature, when you experience these moments, these numinous moments as they've been called, you want more of them, even though you know I'll never be able to explain it. How much more God? When we really just want a God of propositions? No, of course this is not what we want. When Moses encounters this God for the first time, God says, I am being. I am that which is wholly other. I am, Moses, a mystery. God is not so expressible and not so comprehensible as we have in fact been taught. God is wholly other. Even God's name is a mystery. And you might hear this and think to yourself, well, if God's name is a mystery, then are we even able to talk about God? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, we are able to talk about God. And I think we can take the wisdom that we see in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures in our sacred text called the Bible and understand the ways that God is spoken of there as a way that says to us, here are ways you can speak about God. And I point to the text because what we come to realize is that much of the language in the Bible that speaks about God is the language of metaphor. Now, metaphor means to carry across or to carry over. It's placing something that we are familiar with next to something that we are not familiar with to give us a picture and greater understanding of whatever this thing is. And this is what we see all throughout the text. As a matter of fact, I would even say the word God is in of itself a picture, a metaphor, pointing to something beyond our comprehension. It's interesting, I often ask people, when you say God a lot, what do you mean, or what do you picture, or what are you thinking when you use the word God? And maybe you're hearing that question now, and it's kind of like, God is a picture or an idea pointing towards something beyond us. Joseph Campbell says this about the word God. He says, God is not a fact. A fact is an object in the field of time and space, an image in the dream field. God is no dream. God is no fact. God is a word referring us past anything that can be conceived of or named. And Tony, I'll ask you to leave that slide up there for a second. I want to recognize something when we talk about God as mystery. It can feel unsettling depending on who you are, what your background is, where you come from, what your story is. It can feel a little like, I don't know about this. And it can feel like that because what so many of us have learned growing up in this Western culture is that our chief values are security, understanding, confidence, certainty, control. And those things, by the way, in their context, do have their place. But what's happened is we've imported that largely into our religious world. This is why Carl Jung says that one of the jobs of religion is to keep us away from religious experiences. Religion often for us is a security blanket of knowing where we're going to go, and then it also can include relationship and intimacy with God. But when we're introduced to this idea that God's a word that is like catapulting us over our gap of unknowing into something we can't even conceive of, oof. And so if you're here and you feel that like unsettledness, I want to encourage you to sit with that for a time versus wholly rejecting it. Is it possible that God is something far bigger than we could ever conceive? The second reason that I've experienced where it can feel a little unsettling is because, well, if God's just this like thing that can't be conceived of or named, is God just this big amorphous blob of something that's a mystery? It feels pretty impersonal. I mean, is that God even able to care? Is that God able to meet me? And I think the answer to those questions is found in the person of the historical Jesus that we witness in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yes, absolutely, 100% God cares. Because within the Christian tradition, we confidently say that Jesus is the full revelation of God. And what we witness in Jesus is a God who is tender, a God who is intimate, a God who cares, a God who is with and among the poor and the disenfranchised and the lonely. And what we also witness in Jesus is the fullness of humanity, one who has deep and real union, intimate union with this mystery, with this God. And so yes, it can feel unsettling. But this is what we hear even in the name of God. I am a mystery. I am not one that you can control. I'm not one that you can easily define because I transcend every category you create. And what we see in the scripture is that there's this endless attempt to describe God, but there's also an understanding that no one attempt will wholly capture God. And the writers are continually using metaphors. They say things like God is a consuming fire. I don't know what images that brings up into your head, but God is a fire. And this idea of God is fire gives us one insight, one window of knowing into the mystery of the divine. It says one thing about the infinite. We're told that God is living water. Living water is a very specific water in the Jewish consciousness. It means water that you get from a stream or water that comes from rain. In other words, water that will not make you sick like pond water will. It's water that gives and revives life. This is one image that gives you an insight into the heart of the divine mystery. God is a lamb. God is a shepherd. God is a defender. God is a strong tower that you can run into and be saved and find protection. God is an immovable rock. It goes on and on and on and on. And all of these pictures, a rock and a tower, defender, shepherd, lamb, water, fire, all of these are a window for us to look through to learn something about the divine mystery, knowing that no one picture will ever fully capture God. Now, of course, the metaphor that we're the most familiar with in our context and in our culture is the metaphor or the picture of father. And if you're here and that is a metaphor that speaks to you, beautiful, hold on to that. You should hold on to that. I mean, even when Jesus is asked, hey, teach us to pray, his opening words are, our Father. And Jesus, when he often speaks of God, speaks tenderly about his Father as Abba, which is best translated daddy, like a little kid with his big dad. The problem of what's happened, however, in our context, in our culture, is so often when we talk about God as Father, God as explicitly male, what we've done is we've allowed that to be a totalizing picture of God and something that speaks toward God's identity wholly. This is why when you ask people, like, what do you think God looks like? The image of God as an old white man sitting on a throne somewhere with a big white beard and a big white robe. Some of you are like, I think that's Gandalf. We're familiar with it because we've allowed this one image to really in some ways totalize who God is. And not only have we done that with this image of Father and this image of God as male, but we've actually ignored the second most commonly used metaphor for God in the Bible. It's a metaphor that is used more than rock or tower or shepherd or lamb or fire or water. And the metaphor for God that we've roundly ignored and suppressed and overlooked is the metaphor of God as mother. And it's not like it's hidden in these obscure texts. How many of you have heard the term born again Christian? This comes from John chapter 3. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, John chapter 3 has John 3 verse 16 in it. I've just helped you understand that big banner that hangs behind all of the goalposts at football games now. John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible. In that same passage, Jesus says to a religious leader, you have to be born again. Now, I'm going to ask you a very basic biology question. If we are born again, has anyone ever been born of a male? No one answered. You're like, this is about God. It's a mystery. I probably should just keep my mouth shut, right? No. This idea of you have to be born again speaks toward God as female. In Romans chapter 8, there's this beautiful picture given of God who's in child labor trying to give birth to something. Throughout the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, we are introduced to God as a mother giving birth, a pregnant mother awaiting the arrival of her child. We're given pictures in the prophets of God as a loving mother who nurses her children at her breast. We're given a picture of God as a midwife who's there delivering children from women. We're given a picture of God as Lady Wisdom. And wisdom is the one through whom all of creation was fashioned and came to be. We're given a picture of God as glory. When you think of glory, it's like if you're ever in a room and somebody famous is showing up or someone who has a lot of power and authority, when they walk in and everyone's kind of like, ooh, that's glory. Glory means weight or beauty or magnificence or majesty. And when God's glory is spoken of, which is a synonym of presence, it's feminine. Anytime you hear anything about God's Spirit or God's breath or the wind of God, both words in Hebrew and in Greek are feminine. This is why we ought to call the Spirit she if we're going to be biblical literalists. It's interesting that the most often used name of God in the Hebrew scriptures is what we've come to say is Jehovah, which is a translation of the name Yahweh. That's feminine. When you look at the text over and over and over, it's no secret. God is female. It is an image that gives us a window into the heart of the divine mystery that tells us something about that. And we've overlooked it, we've suppressed it, and we've ignored it. And I want to make some comments on that might be hard for some of us as we sit with this. You don't have to be a student of church history or a student of global history to know that over the last 1,000+ years, the Western world has largely been controlled by men. We are the ones who've been in power. We are the ones who've been in charge. And I'm not going to assign evil intent to anyone here who identifies as male and say, this is all your fault, or how dare you. But I do want to make the observation that it's easy, and I'm speaking as a man, it's easy as a man to say, yeah, we're going to ignore those other images. It's easy as a man to quickly identify with God as father or God as male. But here's the thing, we've done this and we've ignored this image of God, this metaphor, this picture of God as woman, to the detriment of everybody. Because when your God is only male, and exclusively male, it allows you to ignore a lot of other things. When I was in seminary, I look back and realized that most of the theologians that I was required to read were white European males. If I wanted to read theology from people of color, there was an elective for that called liberation theology. If I wanted to read theology written by women, there was an elective for that called feminist theology. But the bulk of my schoolwork that was required was written by white European men. We lose something when we do this. I mean, if you came to me and said, hey man, I've heard you really love your family, tell you about your family, and I only talked about me and my son, you would be like, don't you have daughters and a wife? And I'd be like, enough about them. Let's talk about me. You'd be like, this is messed up, but this is what we've largely done. And when we hold on to that, it becomes very easy for us to say to our mothers and our sisters and our daughters, I think you should stay silent. It becomes really easy for us to say to our mothers and our sisters and daughters, oh yeah, no, that level of leadership, you can't be there. And so as a man in the Western Christian tradition who's been entrusted with influence, I want to say to my mothers and my sisters and my daughters, I'm profoundly sorry for my complicity in this, for the way I allowed myself for far too long to remain ignorant to it, for the way that I, for far too long, deemed it not really that important, not knowing that it wounded you and told you that whatever gifts you have, leave them at the door. As a man, I say, forgive me, because I wounded you, my mothers and my sisters and my daughters. And I want to say a word to my fathers and my brothers and my sons. If this kind of gets something going in you, I'm going to ask you to pay attention to that. I brought this up with a friend of mine this week about talking about this, and the response was, yeah, it's hard for us guys sometimes because it means there's more people to compete with. And I said, that's the problem. We believe that life is about competition. What is wrong with us? Guys, I'm being serious. We've been fed a pack of lies, total BS in this culture, that you have to man up, that you have to win, that you have to have balls, that boys will be boys, that you're the sum of your urges, that women exist as objects for our consumption, that it's about getting to the top, that it's about conquering, and that it's about winning. Well, I'll tell you what, Jesus, from everything we know, was male, and that's not the kind of life he lived. And this is what we are invited into, not to suppress the feminine in God or suppress the feminine in our world and suppress the feminine, yes, within us and within our bodies, but to be open to that only so the wholeness that longs to take up residence within us will have a better shot at doing it. It is time for us as men to recognize that we have been dealt a bill of goods that we just need to send back and say, this is not what we want to be consuming anymore. And when we ignore the feminine, we damage ourselves. The invitation for us is to open ourselves to all of the pictures given of the divine mystery so that we can more fully and deeply know who God is, and in doing so, know more fully who we are. We're in a season of Lent right now. This is the first Sunday of Lent. And so for the next 5 weeks, we're going to actually spend time looking at all of the images, or some of the images, of the divine as feminine, of God as mother, of God as midwife, the glory of God and the wisdom of God. And we're not doing this as a way of being like, well, now we've checked that box off, and so we're good to go. But really as a first step toward opening ourselves up to a fuller and more beautiful and robust picture of the divine mystery. And not only as a first step of understanding and learning and growing, but my prayer is that it will be for all of us a first step in continued growth toward the wholeness that longs to be within us and longs to be in this world. Let's pray together. Mother, I ask that you, in this season of Lent, where we're invited to look within, that you would invite us to take this image, this metaphor of you as mother, as you of a loving mama who wants to embrace her kids. This image that points towards something wholly other, beyond conception and beyond words. That you would allow us to bring this image within us, that we would hold on to it, that whatever tension comes up, whatever fear comes up, whatever pain, frustration, joy, excitement, whatever is stirred within us, we ask that you would cause us to sit with that, to be curious about that, to ask questions about that. We ask that you would not allow us to dismiss it out of hand and dismiss it quickly, because we want to know you more. So we ask that you would allow us the joy of getting to know you more deeply. We thank you for all of the images that are given to us, that with each one we can see you in a new way. We thank you for the courage and the poetry of the biblical writers who've offered us their wisdom to carry with us into our lives and into the future. We pray these things together in the strong name of Jesus, and all the children of God said.